I sat in a freezing room and signed away 12 years of my life, while my husband held the hand of a 23-year-old girl. He told me I was dead weight. He told me his miraculous recovery from a terminal illness was entirely due to his own alpha male mindset and his daily green smoothies. He laughed when he handed me a $20,000 settlement check, telling me to go back to my pathetic clinic job. I just smiled and took the money. What he did not know was that the very air in his lungs and the blood pumping through his veins were bought and paid for by me. My name is Kendra, and I am 33 years old. I was about to teach my ex-husband a $150,000 lesson in humility. The air conditioning in the high-end Atlanta mediator office was running entirely too cold, but it matched the atmosphere perfectly. I sat perfectly still looking at the massive polished mahogany table that separated my past from my future. Jamal slid the final divorce decree toward me. He used a heavy gold pen to push the thick stack of papers across the wood. His face wore a smug expression of absolute victory. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, a piece of clothing I had personally selected and paid for months ago, before he decided his new life required a completely new wardrobe. Sitting right next to him was Lexi. She was 23 years old and possessed the kind of manufactured confidence that only comes from constant social media validation and someone else paying her bills. She wore a tight designer dress that looked entirely inappropriate for a legal setting, but Jamal seemed to think it was a trophy on display. Lexi spent the entire mediation session obnoxiously adjusting a massive diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. She kept flicking her wrist so the overhead lights would catch the stones, making sure I saw it every time she reached for her iced coffee. I recognized that jewelry immediately. It was the exact piece charged to our joint account just 2 days before I permanently froze the assets. She thought it was a symbol of her victory over the older, boring wife. She thought she was taking a wealthy, healthy, successful businessman away from a woman who simply did not know how to cater to a high-value man. I watched her trace the diamonds with her acrylic nails, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in my body. There was only the cold, hard clarity of a woman who knew exactly how this story was going to end. Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table. He told me to hurry up and sign the papers so he could get on with his day. He spoke to me with a condescending tone that had become his default over the last year, ever since his health began to stabilize. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated disdain as he explained that his corporate consultant career was taking off faster than he ever imagined. He puffed out his chest and claimed that his health was completely restored through his own sheer willpower and superior mindset. Jamal suffered from a rare and aggressive autoimmune condition that was supposed to put him in a wheelchair 3 years ago. The doctors had told us his organs would slowly shut down, and there was no conventional cure. For 2 years, I watched him waste away crying in our guest bedroom, terrified of losing his mobility and his pride. Now he was sitting here looking robust and healthy, attributing his miraculous recovery to a strict diet of positive thinking and an alpha male mentality. I had the audacity to look me in the eye and say he could no longer be anchored by a woman who was content with a dead-end medical admin job. He told the mediator, a stern older woman who had seen countless marriages end, that he was a high-value man who needed a partner who matched his ambition. He said he needed someone like Lexi who understood his vision and supported his growth, not a woman who pushed paperwork in a clinic basement and complained about him working late. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or defend my career. I did not remind him of the nights I stayed up researching his condition or the countless medical bills I quietly handled so he would never feel the stress of his illness. I simply listened to his delusions of grandeur. I went on to say that I had held him back when he was sick, constantly worrying and bringing down his energy with my practical mindset. He claimed my lack of ambition was suffocating him. He told the mediator that he was a new man, now entirely self-made and ready to take on the world. I picked up the heavy gold pen. The mediator looked at me with a hint of pity, clearly believing I was just another discarded wife being left behind by a man stepping into his prime. She asked if I was absolutely certain I understood the terms of the divorce decree. The terms were brutally simple and overwhelmingly in his favor. Jamal kept the luxury cars. He kept the overpriced downtown condo that he insisted we buy to maintain his image. He kept his inflated lifestyle and his carefully curated persona of success. I walked away with no spousal support and a complete severance of all shared liabilities. I told the mediator I was entirely certain. I signed my name on the first line. My signature was steady and deliberate. Jamal let out a loud breath of relief as if a tremendous burden had been lifted from his broad shoulders. He turned to Lexi and kissed her cheek, whispering that they were finally free to start their real life together. I signed the second page. I did not shed a single tear. I did not show an ounce of sadness or regret. I signed the final page and pushed the stack of papers back across the massive table. Jamal snatched the documents eagerly, practically vibrating with excitement. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a triumphant flourish. He looked down at me one last time with a mixture of pity and triumph. He truly believed he had won everything. He believed he had outgrown me and outsmarted the system. He had absolutely no idea that his entire existence was built on a foundation I secretly provided. We walked out of the mediation room and into the spacious lobby of the legal suite. The scene waiting for me outside those heavy oak doors was exactly as I had anticipated. Jamal had brought an audience for his grand moment of liberation. His mother Brenda and his sister-in-law Ashley were standing near the reception desk. Brenda was a deeply toxic woman who had spent my entire marriage belittling me. She was the quintessential boy mom who treated Jamal like a golden god who could do no wrong. Nothing I ever did was good enough for her son. Ashley was a white woman married to Jamal's brother Andre, and she constantly leveraged her family wealth and corporate connections to make me feel inadequate within the family dynamic. They were out there right now waiting to celebrate my public humiliation. When the doors opened, Ashley actually popped a bottle of champagne right there in the waiting area. The loud pop echoed through the quiet office suite, startling the receptionist. Ashley laughed loudly, pouring the sparkling wine into plastic cups. She raised her cup high and loudly toasted to Jamal and his freedom from his stagnant starter wife. She made sure her voice carried across the room so I would hear every single syllable. Brenda rushed over and hugged Lexi tightly, kissing both her cheeks. Brenda announced to the entire room that Lexi was the beautiful, youthful upgrade her golden boy truly deserved. She looked right at me when she said it, wanting to make sure the insult landed perfectly. She said Jamal finally had a woman who looked the part and understood how to support a successful black man instead of trying to compete with him. I maintained my absolute composure. I did not break my stride as I watched the four of them celebrate my departure from their lives. Jamal walked over to me, blocking my path to the elevator. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out to me with a condescending smirk that made my stomach turn. It was a settlement check for $20,000. He spoke loudly enough for his mother and Ashley to hear every word. Hy told me to take the pennies. He said it would cover the rent for whatever tiny apartment my little clinic salary could afford. He made sure to emphasize the word clinic, dripping with disdain for my supposed lack of ambition. He continued his performance for his audience, stating that he needed all his capital liquid for the new luxury house he was buying with Lexi. He reiterated that he was a new man who cured his own disease through sheer force of will, and he could not be tied down by a woman who still clipped coupons and worried about co-pays. Lexi giggled, leaning her head against his shoulder, while Ashley took a video of the moment for her social media. Brenda nodded in agreement, telling Jamal not to waste any more breath on someone who could never match his financial energy. Ashley raised her plastic cup again and told Lexi they were going shopping in Paris next week to celebrate the divorce properly. Lexi flashed her diamond bracelet again and thanked Ashley, calling her the best sister-in-law ever. I reached out and took the check from his hand. I looked at the $20,000 printed on the paper, and I smiled warmly. It was a genuine smile of pure, unadulterated relief. I thanked him for his incredible generosity. I told him I wished him all the health and happiness he truly deserved. My calm and pleasant reaction unsettled him for a brief second. His brow furrowed as he tried to find the hidden sarcasm in my voice, but there was none. His arrogance quickly overpowered his confusion. He scoffed and turned his back on me, wrapping his arm around Lexi's waist. Brenda laughed and told Jamal to let the trash take itself out. I turned my back on their pathetic celebration and walked toward the elevator. I pressed the call button and waited for the doors to open. Behind me, I could hear Jamal loudly promising Lexi the world, telling her they were going to look at $1 million property that afternoon. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors began to close, I looked at Jamal one last time. I was laughing loudly, surrounded by the women who fed his massive ego and validated his delusions. The heavy metal doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of their laughter and plunging me into a beautiful, quiet silence. I stood alone in the elevator and looked at the $20,000 check in my hand. Jamal truly believed he had won everything. He believed he was a self-made millionaire with perfect health and a brilliant future. He did not know the reality of his situation. He did not know that he did not cure himself with willpower or positive thinking or overpriced green smoothies. Jamal was alive right now, solely because he was enrolled in a highly experimental immunotherapy trial that cost exactly $150,000 every single month. It was an exclusive, highly restricted medical program, sponsored entirely by a phantom biomedical firm. His standard corporate health insurance had explicitly denied the treatment 3 years ago, citing it as experimental and unnecessary. The phantom firm had stepped in and covered every single cent to keep him out of a wheelchair and keep his organs functioning. He had absolutely no idea that I was the sole founder and chief executive officer of that phantom biomedical firm. My company, Apex Biosolutions, owned the patents for the very drug that was keeping him alive. I was not pushing paperwork in a clinic basement. I owned the entire biomedical network. I had deliberately downplayed my massive corporate empire as simple medical admin work to protect his incredibly fragile ego when he got sick. I knew that his pride could not handle being supported by a woman who was infinitely more successful than he was. So I shrank myself. I played the quiet, supportive wife who worked long hours at a boring clinic. I had quietly funneled millions of dollars through anonymous grants to keep my husband alive while he resented me for working late and not having enough energy to entertain his friends. Now I was legally divorced. The papers were signed and filed. I was no longer legally or financially responsible for the man who had cheated on me and humiliated me. The $20,000 check in my hand was nothing compared with the medical costs hidden behind Jamal's polished image. But I did not touch those arrangements that afternoon. I had spent years making decisions for him before he even knew there was a problem, and I wanted the divorce to create a clean line between what belonged to our marriage and what belonged to my company. I stepped into the warm Atlanta sun, feeling lighter than I had in a decade, opened the secure Apex application on my phone, and looked at patient 402J's executive sponsorship file. My thumb hovered over the authorization controls for a moment. Then I locked the screen without changing anything. If Jamal truly believed he was a self-made man, I was going to give him one last opportunity to prove it with his own words and his own choices. I slipped the phone into my bag and walked toward my waiting car, knowing the power to change his reality was still entirely in my hands. As I sat in the back of my chauffeured car, I let my mind wander back to the early days of his diagnosis. Jamal had been a rising star in the consulting world, full of bravado and charm. When the symptoms first started, he ignored them, claiming black men did not need to run to the doctor for every little ache. When his legs finally gave out during a presentation, he was forced to face the reality of his failing body. The diagnosis of a rare autoimmune disorder shattered his entire identity. He became bitter, angry, and resentful. He lashed out at me constantly, blaming my cooking, my cleaning, my very presence for his stress. I absorbed all of his anger because I loved him. I thought that was what a good wife was supposed to do. I thought my sacrifice would eventually be rewarded with gratitude once he was healed. Instead of gratitude, his recovery only fueled his narcissism. As the experimental drugs from my company began to repair his nervous system, his arrogance returned tenfold. He started staying out late, claiming he was networking to rebuild his consulting business. He started criticizing my appearance, telling me I looked tired and worn out compared to the women he saw at his upscale industry events. He forgot that the reason I looked tired was because I was managing a global biomedical firm by day and playing his personal nurse by night. He forgot that while he was sleeping, I was on international conference calls, securing the supply chain for the very medication that allowed him to walk. He took my silence for weakness and my humility for stagnation. Lexi entered the picture about 8 months ago. She was a marketing intern at one of the firms he consulted for. She was young, impressionable, and easily dazzled by his expensive suits and leased sports cars. She did not know that I paid the down payment on those cars. She did not know that his credit was ruined from unpaid medical debts before I secretly cleared them. All she saw was a man who looked like success. And all Jamal saw in her was a mirror reflecting his own inflated self-image. Brenda encouraged the affair from the very beginning. She had never liked me because I did not cater to her every whim, and I refused to treat her grown son like an infant. When Jamal introduced Lexi to the family, Brenda welcomed her with open arms, thrilled to have a woman who would hang on to Jamal every word and agree with everything Brenda said. Ashley was equally thrilled by the divorce. Ashley came from a wealthy white family and had always struggled with the fact that I, a black woman from a working-class background, did not defer to herself, proclaimed superior knowledge of business and society. Ashley loved playing the wealthy savior to Andre and Jamal family. She loved giving them financial advice and dropping names of powerful people she knew. She hated that I never asked for her help or seemed impressed by her country club memberships. Championing Lexi was Ashley's way of solidifying her position as the most successful and important woman in the family hierarchy. She wanted to be the one who guided Jamal's new young wife and taught her how to navigate high society. I watched the Atlanta skyline pass through the tinted windows of my car and thought about patient 402J's file sitting untouched in the Apex system. The drug keeping Jamal alive was not available on the open market. It was an Apex Biosolutions proprietary treatment still in the late stages of clinical trials. The only reason he had received it so consistently was because I had created a pro bono executive tier capable of covering the extraordinary cost when his standard corporate insurance refused. I had built that exception for my husband, not for a stranger who was entitled to my labor. The divorce had changed the personal relationship, but I was not going to make a medical funding decision in the heat of a humiliating afternoon. Jamal would show me in public, and without my prompting, whether he understood any part of the support he had received. Then I would decide what Apex owed him as a patient and what I no longer owed him as a wife. Next Tuesday, Jamal would walk into the elite private infusion center, expecting the royal treatment he had grown accustomed to. He would expect warm blankets, imported sparkling water, and a private chair while the medication dripped into his veins. He would expect Lexi beside him taking carefully angled photos for her followers. None of that confidence came from understanding the system that kept him healthy. It came from never having to see the invoices, denials, grant approvals, or executive exceptions behind it. I leaned my head against the soft leather seat and closed my eyes. The divorce papers were signed. The cars and condo were no longer my domestic problem. The insulting $20,000 check rested in my bag. But the final financial thread between us had not yet been cut. I wanted Jamal to speak one more time about being self-made when he believed an audience admired him. If he chose arrogance again, I would stop protecting him from the price of that arrogance. For the first time in years, I was not rushing to prevent a crisis before he felt it. I was simply waiting for him to reveal who he was when he thought he had won. 2 days passed since I walked out of that mediation office and stepped into the back of my car. I was now sitting behind the massive quartz desk in my executive suite at the downtown headquarters of Apex Biosolutions. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered an unobstructed view of the Atlanta skyline, but my focus was entirely on the clinical trial data illuminated on my monitor. The data showed promising results for the new autoimmune suppression sequence our labs had developed. It was the very same sequence keeping Jamal out of a hospital bed. I scrolled through the patient efficacy charts, sipping a cup of herbal tea and enjoying the absolute tranquility of my environment. The quiet hum of the central air conditioning and the faint tapping of my keyboard were the only sounds in the room. I had built this sanctuary from the ground up. Every piece of custom furniture, every piece of state-of-the-art technology, and every brilliant scientist working on the floors below me were part of the empire I had created while my ex-husband believed I was filing insurance claims in a basement. My peaceful morning was abruptly interrupted. My private cell phone, which I kept on the corner of my desk, began to vibrate incessantly. The screen lit up with dozens of rapid-fire notifications. They were not corporate emails or medical alerts. They were text messages from mutual friends, former neighbors, and a few distant relatives. The messages were full of wide-eyed emojis and frantic questions. Everyone wanted to know if I had seen what was happening online. I picked up the phone and opened my social media applications. I did not even have to search for the drama. It was right there at the top of my feed, pushed into the algorithm by a sudden surge of viral engagement. Lexi had launched a highly targeted, highly produced smear campaign against me, across both TikTok and Instagram. She had spent the last 48 hours filming content in the overpriced downtown condo that Jamal had fought so aggressively to keep in the divorce settlement. The main video, which had already racked up tens of thousands of views, was titled "A House Tour for My High-Value Man." I tapped the screen and watched the spectacle unfold. Lexi was wearing full glam makeup and a designer tracksuit, parading through the living room with a selfie stick. She spun the camera around to show off the expensive leather sofas, the modern art pieces, and the panoramic balcony views. She giggled into the microphone, telling her followers that this was the lifestyle a woman gets when she knows how to properly cater to a real provider. But the house tour was just the setup. The video quickly transitioned into a blatant attack on me. The camera cut to the master bedroom closet. It was the same closet where I had intentionally left behind a few old cardigans and outdated dresses that I simply did not care to pack. Lexi stood in front of the hanging clothes, holding a box of heavy-duty black garbage bags. She looked directly into the lens and announced that it was time to cleanse the space of stagnant energy. She called me a broke, bitter ex-wife who lacked the aesthetic and the ambition to keep a successful corporate man interested. She physically grabbed my old clothes off the hangers and violently shoved them into the garbage bags. She narrated the entire process, mocking the brand names and laughing at the conservative styles. She told her audience that some women were just destined to be starter wives because they refused to elevate their financial energy. She dragged the heavy black bags out to the hallway and kicked them toward the front door. She ended the video by kissing Jamal on the cheek as he walked past the frame holding his briefcase. He did not say anything, but his smug smile spoke volumes. He was completely complicit in this public humiliation. He was letting a 23-year-old girl trash my name to the world so he could feel like a prize to be won. I swiped down to read the comment section. It was a cesspool of validation and toxic encouragement. Lexi followers were eating up the narrative, praising her for upgrading the space and securing the bag. But the most active participants in the comment section were not strangers. They were my former family members. Brenda had left a lengthy comment right at the top of the thread. She wrote that a mother always knows when a woman is wrong for her son, and she was so glad the heavy dark cloud had finally been lifted from her golden boy. She added a series of praying hand emojis and blessed Lexi for bringing light and proper class back into Jamal's life. Right beneath Brenda was a comment from Ashley. My former sister-in-law could not resist the opportunity to leverage her perceived superiority. Ashley commented that it was so brave of me to show up to the mediation in last season's Zara clothing. She told Lexi not to worry about the cheap clothes in the closet because Jamal was upgrading Lexi's entire wardrobe next week during their romantic getaway to Paris. Ashley made sure to tag her own wealthy friends in the comments, turning my supposed poverty into an entertaining spectacle for her country club circle. She wrote that it was tragic how some women simply refused to level up and settle for a clinic salary while their men outgrew them. I sat back in my plush leather executive chair and watched the video play on a loop. I listened to Lexi call me broke. I read Brenda call me a dark cloud. I saw Ashley mock my clothing. Any normal woman would have been devastated. Any normal woman would have immediately typed out a furious response defending her honor and listing her sacrifices. I felt absolutely no urge to defend myself. I did not feel a single drop of anger or sadness. I actually felt a profound sense of amusement. I was watching a group of people confidently dance on the deck of a sinking ship, completely unaware that the hull was already taking on water. I closed the social media applications and placed my phone face down on the desk. I was not going to respond online. I was not going to engage in a digital shouting match with a child who thought a tennis bracelet equated to real wealth. I did not need to prove my value to a timeline of strangers. I operated in the real world where actions carried heavy financial consequences. I reached out and picked up the sleek black receiver of my desk phone. I pressed the extension for my corporate legal department. The line rang twice before the head of my legal team answered. I spoke clearly and concisely. I told my lead attorney to pull the property files for the downtown luxury condo currently occupied by Jamal. When Jamal and I first bought that condo years ago, his credit was utterly destroyed from unpaid medical debts and terrible financial decisions. He could not secure a mortgage on a bicycle, let alone $1 million property. I had purchased the condo entirely in cash. However, to protect my assets and maintain my privacy, I had not put the deed in my own name. I had purchased the property through a discreet shell company called Horizon Holdings. Horizon Holdings was a subsidiary entirely owned and controlled by Apex Biosolutions. During the divorce, Jamal had aggressively demanded to keep the condo. He assumed that because we lived there together, he had a right to it. I had let him keep his residency there without a fight. I had never bothered to correct his assumption that he was the owner. He never read the fine print of the mediation documents that stated he was merely retaining his status as a permitted occupant of a corporately held asset. I was essentially a glorified tenant, living rent-free in a building owned by my company. I instructed my lead attorney to immediately transfer the deed of the downtown condo from Horizon Holdings to the corporate liquidation department. I ordered them to begin the immediate process of listing the property for commercial sale. I explicitly told the legal team to issue a standard 30-day notice to vacate to the current occupants. I wanted the eviction notice drafted on the heaviest, most intimidating legal stationery available. I wanted it sent via certified courier directly to the front door of that specific unit. The head of my legal team did not ask any questions. He simply confirmed the address and assured me the paperwork would be filed with the county clerk by the end of the business day. It was Saturday afternoon, exactly 2 days after the eviction notice was quietly mailed by my corporate legal team. The Atlanta heat was perfectly tempered by a soft breeze, making it ideal weather for an upscale weekend cookout. The host was a mutual friend named Kevin, who owned a sprawling estate in the wealthy Buckhead neighborhood. I received the invitation weeks before the divorce was finalized. Any other woman might have stayed home hiding under the covers and licking her wounds after a highly public separation. I chose to attend. I spent Saturday morning at my favorite boutique selecting an outfit that screamed quiet luxury. I wore a tailored linen jumpsuit in a deep olive green paired with vintage gold accessories. It was understated but impeccably crafted. I did not need to wear obvious designer logos to prove my worth or my bank account balance. I knew exactly who I was and the empire I commanded in secret. When I arrived at Kevin Estate, the backyard was already packed with the Atlanta corporate elite. There was a live jazz band playing near the infinity pool and a private chef managing the massive outdoor grill. I walked down the stone path holding a bottle of aged wine for the host. Almost immediately, I noticed the shift in the atmosphere. Conversations paused as I walked by. Eyes darted toward me and whispers followed in my wake. Jamal and Lexi had clearly been busy spreading their false narrative to our mutual friends. I saw them holding court on the far side of the patio. Jamal was wearing a flashy linen suit holding a cigar and laughing loudly like a king surveying his subjects. Lexi was practically glued to his side wearing a brightly colored sundress that looked entirely too cheap for an elegant garden party. She was waving her diamond tennis bracelet around for anyone who would look, soaking up the attention she felt she rightfully earned by stealing another woman's husband. I ignored them and made my way to the outdoor bar to order a sparkling water with lime. I was standing there enjoying the music and the warm breeze when I felt two presences flank me. I did not even need to turn around to know it was Brenda and Ashley. The heavy scent of Brenda's signature floral perfume and Ashley's overly sweet designer fragrance gave them away instantly. They trapped me against the marble counter of the outdoor bar, intentionally blocking my exit. Ashley was holding a colorful cocktail and looking me up and down with a manufactured expression of extreme pity. She leaned in close, making sure her voice carried over the jazz music so the nearby guests could hear her intended insult. She told me it was so brave of me to show up in last season's Zara clothing. She took a sip of her drink and laughed loudly, looking around for validation from the crowd. She announced to the surrounding guests that Jamal was upgrading Lexi's whole wardrobe next week during their romantic getaway to Paris. She said Jamal felt terrible that I was struggling on my little clinic salary, so they were hoping I could at least enjoy a free meal at the cookout today. Brenda stepped closer, nodding in enthusiastic agreement with Ashley. Brenda looked at my perfectly tailored linen jumpsuit with pure, unadulterated disgust. She chimed in with her own rehearsed insult, clearly planned in advance to humiliate me in public. She told the listening guests that her son needed a woman who matched his financial energy. She claimed Jamal was a corporate powerhouse who required a partner who understood generational wealth and high society, not a woman who clipped coupons and wore discount rack clothing. She patted my arm patronizingly and told me I would eventually find a nice blue-collar man on my own level once I accepted my sad reality. She smiled a sickeningly sweet smile, expecting me to run away in tears or cause a screaming scene that would validate their claims about my bitter nature. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of the embarrassment they were desperately trying to provoke. I simply set my sparkling water down on the marble bar top and smiled right back at them. I looked Brenda directly in the eyes, letting the silence stretch for a long moment until the nearby guests leaned in closer, eager to hear my response. I kept my voice perfectly calm and melodic. I asked Brenda very clearly if that was the same financial energy that required me to pay off his $40,000 credit card debt before we got married. The smug smile vanished from Brenda's face, instantly replaced by pure shock. I did not stop there. I raised my voice just a fraction, ensuring the growing audience heard every single word of my calm retaliation. I asked Brenda if Jamal high-value energy was the exact same energy she relied on when she called me crying for rent money last Thanksgiving because she gambled away her pension at the casino. I asked if it was the same financial energy that allowed Jamal to drive luxury vehicles while I secretly paid the leases every month to prevent them from being repossessed by the bank. The crowd around the bar went completely silent. The jazz band was still playing in the background, but nobody was paying attention to the music anymore. Every single person was staring at Brenda, who was now gasping for air like a fish out of water. Ashley looked absolutely horrified, her pale face turning bright red as she realized her attempt to publicly humiliate me had backfired spectacularly. The whispers started immediately, but this time they were not about my supposed poverty. They were about Jamal's fake wealth and his mother gambling habits. People were looking at them with thinly veiled disgust. The sudden commotion caught Jamal's attention from across the patio. He saw his mother clutching her chest and his sister-in-law looking terrified. He dropped his cigar and stormed over to the bar, his face contorted with absolute fury. Lexi trailed behind him, looking confused and out of place. Jamal pushed his way through the silent crowd and grabbed my arm tightly. I looked down at his hand and then back up at his face, maintaining my icy composure until he quickly let go. He demanded to know what lies I was spreading about his mother and his finances. I told him I was simply clarifying his financial energy for the guests, since Ashley brought the topic up for public discussion. Jamal was practically shaking with rage. His carefully constructed image of a self-made corporate titan was cracking in front of his elite peers and colleagues. He leaned into my face and threatened me right there in front of everyone. He yelled that I was a bitter, jealous liar who could not handle seeing him succeed with a younger, more beautiful woman. He pointed his finger at my chest and announced to the entire patio that he was going to call his lawyers on Monday morning. He threatened to sue me for spousal support just to teach me a lesson about disrespecting a powerful man. He claimed he was entitled to half of my pathetic little savings because he supported me emotionally during the marriage and elevated my social status just by associating with me. I looked at the man I had spent years caring for, the man whose life I had literally saved with my medical resources. He looked so foolish standing there threatening to sue me for pennies while unaware that I controlled millions. He was puffing his chest, trying to salvage his reputation by tearing me down in front of a crowd that was already starting to doubt him. Lexi grabbed his arm and told him to calm down, saying I was not worth his time or his high blood pressure. Brenda was still fanning herself, trying to play the victim of a vicious verbal attack. Ashley was frantically texting on her phone, likely doing damage control with her country club friends who had just witnessed the entire exchange. I picked up my sparkling water and took a slow, refreshing sip. I told Jamal he was more than welcome to call his lawyers on Monday. I told him I would gladly welcome a thorough forensic audit of our marital finances during a spousal support hearing. I smiled and said it would be fascinating for a judge to see exactly who paid for the clothes on his back, the cars in his garage, and the food on his mother table. I told him to make sure his lawyers were prepared to review the $40,000 debt consolidation records holding my signature. Jamal opened his mouth to shout another threat, but no words came out. He knew I was telling the truth, and he knew an audit would completely destroy the facade he had built for his new mistress and his colleagues. He glared at me with pure hatred, his fists clenched at his sides. I simply gave him a polite nod and walked away from the bar, leaving him to face the judging eyes of the crowd he had tried so hard to impress. I navigated through the silent groups of guests, who parted for me like the Red Sea. Nobody dared to whisper as I walked past them. I found a quiet spot near the edge of the infinity pool overlooking the lush green trees of the estate. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction warming my chest. I had not caused a scene. I had not screamed or thrown a drink. I had simply held up a mirror to their delusions and allowed the reflection to do all the work. Jamal thought he could use public humiliation to keep me submissive and quiet, just like he did during our marriage. He thought I would cower away in shame when confronted by his mother and his sister-in-law. He vastly underestimated the strength of a woman who had already detached herself from his toxicity. I stood by the pool and watched him from a distance. I was frantically trying to regain control of the narrative, pulling Kevin aside to explain away my comments as the ravings of a heartbroken ex-wife. Lexi looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting her weight from foot to foot as guests cast sideways glances at her diamond bracelet. The seeds of doubt had been planted in her mind and in the minds of everyone present. The foundation of his lies was beginning to crumble, and I was ready to deliver the next blow. The confrontation at the bar should have ended there, but Jamal could never leave a room while someone else controlled the story. I had barely taken 3 steps toward the pool when I heard him raise his voice behind me. He was no longer speaking to me. He was speaking to the crowd, rebuilding his image as quickly as he could. He laughed too loudly and announced that everybody was making a ridiculous amount of drama over old credit card debt. He said successful people used leverage all the time. Then he pointed toward himself and declared that the proof of his financial strength was standing right in front of them. He was healthy, he was working, he was traveling. He had the best medical care money could buy. Lexi immediately moved back to his side because she recognized the version of Jamal. She liked the performer. She touched his chest and told the people nearest them that his next infusion was scheduled for Tuesday and that his premium corporate health insurance covered everything. Ashley recovered just enough to nod enthusiastically. She told the guests that Jamal's consulting firm had an executive health package most people could only dream about. Brenda folded her arms and looked at me as though this new speech erased every fact I had just exposed. Jamal saw me stop near the pool and mistook my silence for surrender. He called across the patio that I should listen carefully because I had spent years acting as if he needed me. He said I used to hover over his medical bills because handling paperwork made me feel important. According to him, his company benefits and his own professional value had taken over a long time ago. He said the clinic knew exactly who he was, and that people like him did not stand at billing counters begging for help. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. They had just heard me describe the debt I had paid, but Jamal was betting that confidence would matter more than evidence. He said his insurance had already been renewed for the year and would cover his specialized treatments before the Paris trip. He added that the only reason I ever touched the medical paperwork was because I liked pretending to be indispensable. I almost admired the consistency of his delusion. For 3 consecutive years, his standard corporate insurer had denied the experimental immunotherapy. I had copies of every denial letter. I had read every line while Jamal slept. The first denial called the treatment investigational. The second said there was insufficient evidence for routine coverage. The third repeated the same conclusion even after his doctors documented how dramatically his condition improved. Apex had paid because I authorized Apex to pay. His employer had never rescued him. His black card had never rescued him. I had. Jamal lifted his cigar from the table where he had dropped it during our argument and held it like a microphone. He told everyone he was tired of hearing old stories about what I had done years ago. He said the present was what mattered, and the present showed a healthy man preparing for Europe while his bitter ex-wife counted receipts. That was the sentence that made the decision simple. I walked toward a quieter corner of the patio, near a row of tall hedges. The music covered the small sounds around me. I took my phone from my bag and opened the encrypted Apex executive portal. The patient dashboard loaded instantly. I typed the identifier I had known by memory for years, 402J. His file appeared on the screen. Current status pro bono executive tier. Sponsorship Authority Office of the Founder and CEO. Monthly projected cost, $150,000. Standard insurance contribution 0. For a few seconds I looked at the line that represented everything I had hidden from him. That status had been created during the worst months of his illness, when he could barely stand without help, and I was terrified I would lose him. I remembered sitting beside him at 2 in the morning while he cried because his hands would not stop shaking. I remembered promising that I would find a way. I had kept that promise long after he stopped keeping any of his. The screen asked whether I wanted to modify the sponsorship authorization. I selected yes. A second security prompt appeared. I authenticated the request and opened the internal message channel to my chief medical officer. I did not write an emotional explanation. I did not mention the affair, the divorce, the champagne, or the insults. Apex was a corporation, not a weapon for personal drama, and I wanted the record to be clear. Jamal had been receiving a discretionary executive subsidy created under my authority. That discretionary support was ending now that the personal basis for the exception no longer existed. I typed remove patient 402J from the pro bono executive tier. Move him to self-pay, effective immediately. I read the sentence once, then pressed send. The reply came less than a minute later. The change would be processed through the proper clinical and financial channels. His medical records and treatment options would remain intact. Nothing about his diagnosis would be hidden from him. Nothing would prevent him from pursuing the treatment. But Apex would no longer pay the bill for him. That distinction mattered to me. I was not taking medicine out of his hands. I was taking my wallet out of his life. I locked my phone and returned it to my bag. Across the patio, Jamal was still talking. He told Kevin and the people around him that his upcoming infusion was basically a formality. He laughed that the clinic staff loved him because he was one of their most important executive patients. Lexi had started smiling again. Ashley looked relieved that he had found a new status symbol to display. Brenda lifted her chin as if her son's insurance card had just disproved $40,000 of documented debt. Jamal caught my eye. He raised his glass toward me in a mocking toast. I raised my sparkling water back. He grinned because he thought I had finally accepted defeat. I smiled because I knew his next appointment was no longer a performance financed by an invisible wife. On Tuesday morning, he would walk into that private clinic believing his corporate insurance made him untouchable. The receptionist would type his name, open the same file I had just changed, and ask him a question nobody in his circle had ever forced him to answer. How would you like to pay? Tuesday morning arrived with a crispness in the air that felt almost poetic. I was back in my office sitting behind my massive quartz desk, monitoring the situation from a safe distance, while Jamal walked blindly into the trap he had built for himself. The elite private infusion center he used was located in one of the most expensive medical pavilions in Buckhead. It was a facility designed exclusively for the ultra-wealthy, featuring valet parking, private recovery suites, catered lunches, and plush leather recliners. It was the exact type of place Jamal felt he belonged. According to the security logs that my team had access to, he pulled his least luxury sedan into the valet circle, right on time, tossing his keys to the attendant with his usual arrogant flair. Lexi stepped out of the passenger side, already holding her phone up to record the entire experience for her social media followers. She was treating a critical medical facility like it was a five-star day spa. She spun around in the lobby, whispering into her camera about how her high-value man only received the absolute best VIP medical care available. Jamal walked beside her, puffing out his chest and soaking up the manufactured adoration. He loved the attention. He loved walking through those sliding glass doors and having the staff greet him. He felt like royalty. He felt invincible. He had absolutely no idea that his crown had already been repossessed. They walked up to the pristine marble reception desk. The waiting room was quiet and serene, filled with soft classical music and other wealthy patients reading financial magazines or sipping artisanal tea. Jamal leaned against the counter, flashing his most charming smile at the head receptionist. She was a professional woman who had dealt with countless demanding executives, but she always maintained a polite demeanor. Jamal announced his arrival for his 10 o'clock infusion, expecting her to immediately summon a nurse to escort him to his private suite. The receptionist typed his name into the system. She looked at the screen and her professional smile faltered just a fraction. She looked back up at Jamal and asked him for his black card or his preferred method of payment for the session. Jamal laughed out loud, a booming sound that echoed inappropriately through the quiet waiting area. He shook his head and patronizingly told the receptionist to check his file again. He leaned in close and told her that he did not pay out of pocket. He boasted that his treatment was fully covered by an exclusive anonymous corporate sponsor. He looked over his shoulder to make sure Lexi was catching this flex on camera. He wanted his new girlfriend and all her followers to see just how important he was to the corporate world. The receptionist did not flinch. She kept her eyes on her computer monitor, clicking through his patient profile. She took a deep breath and looked him dead in the eyes. She told him very clearly that his corporate sponsorship had been completely revoked. She informed him that his patient status had been officially moved from the pro bono executive tier to standard self-pay. She spoke in a calm, measured voice that offered absolutely no room for debate. Jamal stopped smiling. He told her she was making a ridiculous mistake. He demanded she call her billing department and fix the administrative error immediately. The receptionist shook her head and turned the monitor slightly so he could see the glaring red text on his file. She told him there was no error. The funding had been permanently pulled by the sponsor effective 2 days ago. She then delivered the final crushing blow. She told him that if he wished to proceed with his infusion today, the cost would be exactly $150,000 payable immediately before he could even step foot past the lobby. Lexi stopped recording. She lowered her phone and stared at the receptionist with her mouth hanging open. $150,000 for a single medical appointment was a number her brain could barely process. She looked at Jamal, expecting him to casually pull out a black card and laugh off the expense. She expected him to prove his wealth right then and there. But Jamal was completely frozen. All the color drained from his face. His carefully constructed facade was cracking under the weight of a six-figure medical bill. He looked around the lobby, suddenly acutely aware of the other wealthy patients who had stopped reading their magazines to watch the drama unfold. These were real millionaires sitting in those plush chairs, and they were watching Jamal get exposed as a fraud. He tried to maintain his composure, but the panic was rising in his chest. He reached into his wallet and pulled out his primary credit card, sliding it across the marble counter. He told the receptionist to just run the card for a partial payment so he could get his treatment while his team sorted out the corporate error. The receptionist took the card and ran it through the terminal. The machine beeped a loud, sharp sound of rejection. She slid the card back across the counter and told him it was declined. Jamal lost his mind. The panic morphed into pure defensive rage. He slammed his fist down on the marble counter, causing the receptionist to jump back. He started yelling at the top of his lungs, demanding to speak to the clinic director immediately. He screamed that he was a vital patient and that they were legally obligated to give him his medication. He threatened to sue the entire medical pavilion for malpractice. He yelled that he was a high-value corporate consultant and they were treating him like garbage. His voice cracked as the fear truly began to set in. Without that infusion, his body would begin to shut down. His joints would stiffen, and the relentless pain would return. He was screaming because he was terrified. Lexi was completely mortified. She was standing next to a man who was throwing a massive temper tantrum in a luxury medical lobby because his credit card had declined. The other patients were whispering to each other, looking at Jamal with absolute disgust. A security guard slowly made his way over to the reception desk, placing a hand on his radio. Lexi grabbed Jamal by the arm and begged him to lower his voice. She told him he was embarrassing her. She told him people were staring. Jamal yanked his arm away from her grip, his eyes wild and desperate. The clinic director, a distinguished older man in a white coat, finally emerged from the back offices. He walked up to the front desk and looked at Jamal with zero sympathy. The director told Jamal that this was a private medical facility and they did not tolerate aggressive behavior in their lobby. He confirmed exactly what the receptionist had said. The funding was gone, the sponsor had pulled the plug. There was no grace period, and there were no payment plans for experimental treatments. The director told Jamal that unless he could produce $150,000 in cleared funds, right this second, he needed to leave the premises immediately or security would escort him out. Jamal stared at the director, his chest heaving as he realized there was no way out. He could not charm or bully his way past a medical administration that dealt with billionaires on a daily basis. He looked down at his declined credit card sitting on the marble counter. He looked at Lexi, who was staring at him like he was a stranger. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him in real time. He grabbed his credit card and shoved it back into his wallet. He tried to salvage whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left by straightening his suit jacket and loudly announcing that he would be taking his business to a more professional establishment. It was a pathetic exit line. The director simply nodded and gestured toward the sliding glass doors. Lexi Power walked out of the clinic ahead of him, keeping her head down to avoid eye contact with the wealthy patients who were openly sneering at them. Jamal followed her out, his shoulders slumped and his hands trembling. Back in my office, my desk phone chimed with a secure message from the clinic director. The message simply stated that the patient had been turned away due to lack of funds and had vacated the premises. I read the message and took another slow sip of my herbal tea. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked out over the Atlanta skyline. The absolute beauty of the situation was that Jamal still had no idea I was the one pulling the strings. He genuinely believed it was a corporate error or a glitch in the medical billing system. He was going to spend the next few hours frantically making calls, trying to figure out how to restore his phantom sponsorship. He was going to hit dead end after dead end until sheer desperation forced him to reach out to the one person he thought he had left behind in the dirt. I placed my phone right in the center of my quartz desk. I knew exactly who was going to call me next, and I was entirely prepared to answer. I sat at my massive quartz desk for only a few more minutes before my executive assistant knocked softly on the glass door. She reminded me that the quarterly board meeting was scheduled to begin in 10 minutes. I picked up my phone and my tablet, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. I walked out of my office and down the long corridor toward the main boardroom. The hallways of Apex Biosolutions were lined with frosted glass and brushed steel, reflecting the cutting-edge nature of our work. My executive team was already gathering in the boardroom when I arrived. These were some of the most brilliant medical and financial minds in the country, and they all reported directly to me. We took our seats around the long, polished conference table. I placed my private cell phone face up next to my tablet. I knew Jamal was going to call me, but I was not going to let his impending meltdown disrupt my corporate responsibilities. The meeting began with a presentation from my chief financial officer regarding our international expansion into the European market. I listened intently, taking notes and asking pointed questions about our regulatory compliance in overseas territories. I was fully engaged in the high-level corporate strategy of my empire. In Jamal's mind, I was probably sitting in a cramped cubicle somewhere, sorting through stacks of manila folders and taking abuse from middle management. I truly believed my entire professional existence revolved around filing basic insurance claims and answering customer service emails. He had spent our entire marriage diminishing my intellect so he could feel like the smartest person in the room. He needed me to be small so he could feel big. About 45 minutes into the board meeting, my private cell phone began to vibrate against the conference table. The screen lit up displaying Jamal's name. I did not immediately reach for it. I let it vibrate until the call went to voicemail. I wanted him to sweat. I wanted the reality of his situation to sink deep into his bones before he spoke to me. Less than 30 seconds later, the phone began to vibrate again. The chief financial officer paused his presentation, noticing the persistent buzzing. I held up my hand and apologized to the board. I told them I needed to take an urgent personal call, but it would only take a moment. I picked up the phone and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the sprawling city below. I swiped the screen and answered the call, bringing the phone to my ear. I did not even have the chance to say hello before Jamal's voice exploded through the speaker. He was practically screaming, his voice pitching upward in a frantic, panicked tone I had never heard from him before. He demanded to know what kind of incompetent game I was playing. He yelled that he was standing in the lobby of his clinic and they were refusing to give him his treatment. He said they were trying to charge him $150,000 for a single infusion. I was breathing heavily, sounding like a cornered animal trying to fight its way out of a trap. I kept my voice completely level and professional. I asked him why he was calling me about his medical bills. That question only infuriated him further. He screamed that I knew exactly why he was calling. He claimed that because I was so bitter about the divorce, I must have intentionally neglected to file his sponsorship renewal paperwork at my clinic job. In his deeply narcissistic mind, the only logical explanation for his current crisis was that I had made a petty administrative error out of spite. He actually believed I had the power to mess up a multi-million-dollar corporate sponsorship just by losing a file on my supposed cubicle desk. He told me I was a vindictive, jealous woman who was trying to sabotage his health because I could not handle seeing him happy with Lexi. I listened to his entire tirade without interrupting. I could hear the background noise of the clinic lobby through the phone. I could hear Lexi crying in the distance, asking him what they were going to do. Jamal ignored her, focusing all of his terror and rage onto me. He ordered me to get off the phone and immediately call my superiors at the clinic. He demanded that I beg my bosses to fix my incompetent mistake right this second. He threatened to call the medical board and have me fired from my job if I did not resolve the billing issue before he lost his appointment slot. He said he was a high-value consultant, and his time was too important to be wasted on my petty clerical errors. He told me to do my job for once in my life and fix his insurance. His sheer audacity was almost breathtaking. Even while standing on the precipice of absolute financial and physical ruin, he still found a way to speak down to me. He still needed to assert his dominance and treat me like a subordinate. I looked out the window at the traffic crawling along the highway far below. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent building Apex Biosolutions. I thought about the millions of dollars of my own personal wealth I had quietly allocated to keep this ungrateful, arrogant man breathing. I thought about the diamond tennis bracelet he bought for his 23-year-old mistress, using funds from our joint account while I was paying for the very drug keeping his organs functioning. Jamal demanded to know if I was listening to him. He yelled my name, telling me to stop playing games and fix the paperwork immediately. I took a slow, deep breath. I let the silence stretch over the phone line, forcing him to wait for my response. When I finally spoke, my voice was as cold and hard as ice. I told him I did not handle his billing anymore. I spoke slowly, ensuring he heard every single word with absolute clarity. I told him he was a self-made, high-value man with a superior mindset. I reminded him that he had just told a mediator he cured his own illness through sheer willpower and alpha energy. I said a man of his incredible stature and corporate success could surely cover a simple $150,000 medical bill without relying on his stagnant starter wife. Jamal stopped screaming. The silence on his end of the line was absolute. The realization that I was not going to help him, that I was completely detached from his crisis, finally hit him. He tried to speak, but his voice was completely gone. He stammered, trying to find the words to bully me back into submission, but the power dynamic had completely shifted. He was no longer the dominant husband lecturing his boring wife. He was a terrified, sick man begging a stranger for his life. Before he could formulate a coherent sentence, I delivered my final statement. I told him to have a great time in Paris with Lexi and to make sure he upgraded her wardrobe just like Ashley promised. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the end call button, cutting off whatever desperate plea he was about to make. I stood by the window for another moment, letting the beautiful quiet wash over me. I had just severed the final cord connecting me to my past. I turned around and walked back to the conference table. My executive board was waiting patiently in silence. I set my phone down face down on the polished wood. I looked at my chief financial officer and smiled. I told him to please continue his presentation on our European expansion strategies. I took my seat and refocused my attention on growing my global empire, leaving Jamal to drown in the shallow puddle of his own arrogance. The rest of the board meeting proceeded flawlessly. We finalized the acquisition of 2 smaller research facilities in Germany and approved the budget for the next fiscal quarter. I was completely present in the room, my mind sharp and my vision clear. For the first time in years, I did not have a heavy weight sitting on my chest. I did not have to worry about rushing home to monitor Jamal's diet or schedule his physical therapy appointments. I did not have to pretend to be small so he could feel tall. The energy in the room was electric, fueled by our collective success and the incredible potential of the company I had built. When the meeting concluded, I thanked my team for their exceptional work and headed back to my executive suite. As I walked down the brushed steel corridor, my assistant fell into step beside me, handing me a stack of documents requiring my signature. She informed me that my legal team had successfully filed the eviction notice for the downtown condo, and it was currently out for delivery via certified courier. She also mentioned that my private line had rung several more times during the board meeting, but she had forwarded all the calls to voicemail as per my standing instructions. I thanked her and stepped into my office, letting the heavy glass door close behind me. I walked over to my desk and picked up my private cell phone. There were 12 missed calls from Jamal and 4 from Lexi. I did not bother listening to the voicemails. They were entirely predictable. I knew they were currently experiencing the frantic, chaotic panic of people who had just realized the floor beneath them was an illusion. They were likely sitting in the plush lobby of that elite clinic, desperately trying to negotiate with a medical administration that did not care about their social media followers or their leased luxury vehicles. They were learning that real wealth was not about posting expensive dinners online or buying flashy jewelry. Real wealth was power. Real wealth was the ability to control outcomes and dictate terms. I had given Jamal access to my power out of love, and he had used it to finance his betrayal. Now the access was permanently revoked. I sat down in my leather chair and opened the clinical trial data on my monitor once again. I had a company to run. I had lives to save. I had an empire to expand. Jamal and Lexi were no longer my concern. They were simply a closed file in the archives of my past. I took a sip of my tea and smiled, ready for whatever the rest of the day would bring. Thursday afternoon arrived with a gentle warmth that settled over the city of Atlanta. I was still in my executive suite at the Apex Biosolutions headquarters, wrapping up a highly productive week. I had just signed off on a multi-million-dollar grant for a new research initiative, and my mind was buzzing with the incredible possibilities of the future. I stood up from my massive quartz desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the bustling streets far below. I felt an incredible sense of peace washing over my entire body. I knew exactly what was happening across town at the international airport. Jamal and Lexi were scheduled to fly out to Paris that evening for their grand romantic getaway. Ashley had bragged about the trip endlessly in the family group chat before I finally muted the conversation. Jamal had promised Lexi a lavish European vacation to celebrate his newly acquired freedom from our marriage. He had promised her first-class tickets, luxury shopping sprees along the Champs-Élysées, and five-star dining experiences overlooking the Eiffel Tower. He had made those extravagant promises, assuming his massive medical bills would continue to be quietly handled by the phantom biomedical firm he thought was sponsoring him. He assumed he could continue living the fabulous lifestyle of the rich and famous without ever paying the actual cost of his existence. I was completely unaware of the aggressive billing protocols implemented by the elite private clinic he attended. The clinic did not operate like a standard public hospital. They catered exclusively to the ultra-wealthy, and they absolutely did not tolerate missed appointments or breached treatment contracts. When a patient on a self-pay tier failed to show up for a highly specialized custom mixed infusion, the clinic immediately triggered a severe financial penalty protocol. The medication designed specifically for Jamal's rare, autoimmune condition had a shelf life of only a few short hours once it was prepared in the laboratory. Because Jamal had thrown a massive temper tantrum and stormed out of the clinic lobby 2 days ago without receiving his treatment, the clinic had been forced to destroy the $150,000 batch of medication. Their financial department did not send polite warning letters in the mail or offer flexible payment plans for their clients. They simply executed the auto draft authorization that was buried deep in the initial intake paperwork Jamal had signed years ago when I first got him admitted to the facility. The clinic had aggressively swept his personal checking accounts and charged every single credit card he had on file to recoup the cost of the destroyed medication and the steep breach of contract penalty fees. They had systematically drained every single drop of liquid capital he possessed in a matter of seconds, leaving him with absolutely nothing. I walked back to my desk and picked up my cup of warm herbal tea. Right on cue, my private cell phone began to vibrate across the smooth surface of my desk. The caller identification displayed an unknown number. I normally let unknown numbers go straight to voicemail, but I had a very strong intuition about who was on the other end of the line today. I picked up the phone and swiped the screen to answer, bringing the device to my ear without saying a single word. I immediately heard the chaotic ambient noise of the international terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. I could hear the distinct sound of rolling luggage wheels clacking against the hard tile floors and the muffled voice of an airport announcer echoing through the massive building. Then I heard Lexi speaking. Her voice was incredibly shrill and vibrating with absolute sheer panic. Her manufactured influencer confidence, the arrogant tone she had used in the mediation room and in her social media videos was completely gone. It was replaced by the frantic desperation of a young girl whose entire financial safety net had just evaporated into thin air in front of a crowded airline check-in counter. She did not bother introducing herself or offering a polite greeting. She immediately launched into a hysterical tirade demanding to know what I had done to Jamal's bank accounts. Lexi was practically hyperventilating as she described the embarrassing scene unfolding at the airport. She said they were standing at the exclusive first-class check-in desk for their overnight flight to Paris. She had been filming content for her followers showing off her designer luggage and her shiny diamond tennis bracelet, ready to document their luxurious journey across the ocean. But when Jamal handed his premium credit card to the ticketing agent to cover the international departure taxes, the card was immediately declined. Lexi yelled into the phone that Jamal had confidently handed the agent a second card, and then a third card, trying to play off the initial rejection as a simple bank error. Every single piece of plastic he offered was rejected by the airline terminal system. She described the absolute humiliation of standing in the first-class line, while the other wealthy passengers stared at them with thinly veiled judgment and amusement. The ticketing agent had even been forced to confiscate one of Jamal's premium cards right there at the counter because the issuer had flagged it for severe overdrafting and suspected fraud. Lexi told me Jamal had stepped away from the counter to check his mobile banking applications, only to discover that his accounts were entirely empty. The private medical clinic had executed their penalty clauses and wiped him out completely. He had zero available balances, and his credit lines were maxed out beyond their limits. Lexi was screaming into the phone that her dream vacation was being ruined because of my petty jealousy. She actually blamed me for the situation, claiming I must have intentionally messed up his corporate health insurance sponsorship at my little clinic job just to embarrass them at the airport. Her sheer audacity was truly something to behold. Even in the middle of a catastrophic financial meltdown, she still felt entitled to demand a solution from the woman she had helped discard. She demanded that I immediately wire the $20,000 settlement money back into Jamal's account. She claimed it was the least I could do to fix my administrative error so they could board their flight and salvage their trip. She whined that she had already posted about flying first class to Paris to all of her followers, and she absolutely refused to suffer the indignity of sitting in an economy class seat for 12 hours. She told me I needed to transfer the funds right this second because she was not going to let a bitter older woman ruin her elevated lifestyle. She said Jamal was far too important to be treated this way, and it was my responsibility to make sure his medical bills were handled properly. I listened to her frantic, entitled demands, and I could not contain myself any longer. I laughed out loud. The bright melodic sound of my genuine laughter echoed through my quiet executive office. I asked Lexi why a highly successful self-made corporate titan like Jamal would ever need to borrow $20,000 from his stagnant starter wife just to board a commercial airplane. I asked her why a man who claimed to have boundless financial energy could not simply call his bank and resolve a basic funding issue. Lexi went completely silent on the other end of the line. The reality of my question hung heavily in the air between us, piercing through her delusions of grandeur. She realized in that brief moment of silence that the man she had stolen was not the wealthy provider he pretended to be. How was a man who relied on the very woman he discarded to maintain his entire existence? I kept my voice perfectly calm and professional as I delivered the final crushing blow to her fragile ego. I told her there was no insurance glitch and there was no administrative error for me to fix. I told her Jamal was completely broke and drowning in insurmountable medical debt because the anonymous sponsor who had kept him alive for 3 years had permanently cut him off. I reminded Lexi that she had loudly bragged to everyone in the mediation lobby about wanting the whole man and taking him away from me. I told her she now got to keep every single part of him, which included his massive financial burdens, his ruined credit, and his rapidly failing health. I told her she had won the grand prize, and she needed to learn how to finance it herself without my silent contributions. I told her to enjoy her flight in economy class if they could even afford the basic baggage fees to get their designer suitcases on the plane. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the end call button, cutting off whatever excuse she was about to make. I set the phone face down on my desk, leaving her completely stranded at the airport, with a man who had absolutely nothing left to offer her. I walked back over to the windows and looked out at the city once more. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the Atlanta skyline. I felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. For years I had carried the heavy burden of Jamal's physical and financial well-being on my shoulders. I had sacrificed my own peace of mind to ensure he never felt the crushing weight of his illness. I had allowed his mother Brenda to insult me, and his sister-in-law Ashley to patronize me, all because I wanted to protect the fragile pride of the man I loved. But love should never require a woman to diminish her own light so a man can shine brighter. Love should never demand that you accept disrespect and infidelity as the cost of loyalty. Jamal had chosen to betray me, and in doing so, he had severed the lifeline that kept him afloat. I was about to learn the true cost of his arrogance, and Lexi was about to learn that shiny diamond bracelets could not pay for life-saving medical infusions. I returned to my desk and opened my laptop, reviewing the final details for a major industry conference I was scheduled to host the following month. My career was thriving, and my company was expanding at an unprecedented rate. I did not have time to dwell on the miserable situation unfolding at the airport. I knew Jamal and Lexi were likely arguing near the ticketing counter trying to figure out how to salvage their ruined evening. I knew they would eventually have to collect their luggage and take a rideshare back to the city carrying the heavy realization that their luxurious fantasy was over. I also knew that Jamal pride would prevent him from admitting the truth to his family. He would spin a lie to Brenda and Ashley claiming there was a banking error or a temporary hold on his accounts. He would never admit that he was broke and entirely dependent on my charity. But the truth always has a way of coming to light, especially when a medical condition requires immediate and expensive intervention. Jamal's health was going to deteriorate without the specialized medication, and his family was going to panic when they realized they could not afford to save him. I closed my laptop and packed my designer briefcase ready to head home for the evening. I walked out of my executive suite feeling completely unbothered by the chaos I had just unleashed. I had simply stopped protecting people from the natural consequences of their own terrible choices. Jamal and Lexi were finally experiencing the real world without my invisible safety net to catch them when they fell. I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the parking garage, looking forward to a quiet, relaxing evening in my beautiful home. The storm was just beginning for them, but for me, the skies had never been clearer. The family panic started before I reached home that Thursday night. My phone connected to the car system and began displaying a stream of notifications from the family group chat I had muted earlier in the week. I had never left the chat. I simply stopped allowing it to interrupt my day. Now the message count climbed so quickly that even the silent banner looked frantic. I opened the thread when I was safely inside my house. Brenda had begun with prayer emojis and a demand that everybody stop blaming Jamal. She wrote that his health was declining because the clinic had made an administrative mistake. Jamal followed with a long message insisting the sponsor problem was temporary. He claimed his accounts had only been frozen because the clinic had processed a disputed charge incorrectly. Lexi contributed exactly once. She wrote that someone needed to fix the situation before Jamal got worse, then disappeared from the conversation. Ashley took over. Her messages arrived in bursts of confidence. She said everyone was panicking unnecessarily because medical systems were about relationships. She reminded the family that she knew executives, hospital administrators, attorneys, and people who sat on nonprofit boards. She wrote that Kendra's little administrative contacts were obviously useless, but she would use real corporate connections. I read the sentence twice and laughed softly. Jamal immediately encouraged her. He said he needed somebody competent to get around the clinic bureaucracy. Brenda praised Ashley for always knowing how to handle professional people. The same family that had spent years dismissing my work was now congratulating itself for finally putting a capable woman in charge. Then Ashley posted the name that changed the conversation: Apex Biosolutions. She told them she had researched the anonymous sponsor listed in Jamal's old billing correspondence and traced the funding network back to Apex. She described the company as one of the most powerful biomedical funding organizations in the region. She said the chief executive officer was famously private but controlled discretionary medical grants worth millions. According to Ashley, all they needed was an emergency executive exception. My phone sat warm in my hand while I watched my former sister-in-law explain my own company to me. She claimed she had already sent emails through several professional contacts and copied every impressive title she could find. She said she had emphasized Jamal's status as a high-level consultant, his rare diagnosis, and the reputational value Apex could gain by saving a successful Black executive. She added that she had made it very clear the current problem was caused by incompetent lower-level administration. Jamal replied with a row of applause emojis. Brenda wrote, "God is good." Ashley was not finished. About 20 minutes later, she announced that she had secured an emergency meeting at Apex headquarters for Friday morning at 10. She said the executive office had agreed to hear the request in person. She told Jamal to wear a suit, bring his medical documents, and let her do the talking. She told Brenda to come because a mother's emotional testimony could help. She told Lexi to dress appropriately and avoid filming until after the grant was approved. Nobody asked why a supposedly broke medical administrator named Kendra had gone completely silent. I leaned back on my sofa and looked around the quiet room. For the first time since the divorce, their chaos was arriving at my door without entering my life. I could have let Ashley travel downtown, argue with reception, and discover the truth through a nameplate on a wall. But the arrogance in the group chat deserved a cleaner ending. I unmuted the conversation. The typing indicator stopped almost immediately, as if everyone had noticed my presence at once. Ashley sent the first message. She asked why I was still in the family chat when I was no longer family. Brenda followed by saying I should not interfere with Jamal's medical emergency. Jamal wrote that if I had any decency left, I would give Ashley whatever billing information she needed and stay out of the way. I typed one sentence. "I'll see you Friday at 10 a.m., Ashley. Don't be late." For nearly a full minute, nobody replied. Then Ashley sent a laughing emoji. She assumed I meant I would be working somewhere in the building. She wrote that I should not embarrass myself by trying to sit in on an executive meeting and warned me that she would have security remove me if I caused a scene. Brenda added that I needed to stop obsessing over Jamal and accept that he had moved on. Jamal's response was the most revealing. He told me that if I happened to work at Apex now, I should be grateful his crisis had given me access to a respectable company. He said I might finally learn something about ambition by watching real executives solve the problem I created. I did not answer again. Instead, I opened my secure work calendar. The 10 o'clock block was already reserved. My executive office had received Ashley's escalating requests through the general grant channel. My staff had recognized Jamal's patient identifier and routed the matter to me exactly as our internal policy required. I changed the meeting label from discretionary grant review to private executive review and authorized access for 4 guests: Jamal, Lexi, Brenda, and Ashley. No one else needed to be in the room. I also instructed my assistant to prepare a complete factual packet. It included the 3 years of insurance denials, every Apex grant payment tied to patient 402J, the corporate ownership documents for the condo, the vehicle payment records that had passed through accounts I controlled, and the patent registrations for the immunotherapy platform. I did not want a dramatic argument based on memory. I wanted receipts arranged in chronological order. By 11 that night, the group chat had become a celebration again. Ashley was telling everyone the meeting proved her network was stronger than any problem. Brenda wrote that the Apex CEO would obviously recognize Jamal's value. Jamal announced that once the grant was restored, he intended to file complaints against the clinic staff who had embarrassed him. Lexi reappeared long enough to ask whether the Paris trip could be rescheduled after Friday. I set my phone on the nightstand and went to sleep. Friday morning, the city was clear and bright. I arrived at Apex early, reviewed the clinical reports, and confirmed that Jamal's condition was deteriorating after the mist infusion. The numbers did not make me happy. I had loved that man once, and I was not celebrating pain. But sympathy did not create an obligation to subsidize someone who had chosen betrayal, contempt, and public humiliation. At 9:45, my assistant informed me that the guest list had checked in downstairs. Ashley had arrived exactly as I expected, dressed to impress, carrying a thick folder, speaking to the lobby staff, as if she were the person granting favors instead of requesting one. Brenda was beside her. Lexi stood close to Jamal, although not as close as she had in the mediation office. Jamal himself looked weaker than he had at the cookout. His posture was rigid, and every few steps he paused as if his joints were fighting him. I looked at the clock. 9:52. They believed they had come to persuade the mysterious CEO of Apex Biosolutions to save Jamal from a problem caused by his incompetent ex-wife. They were finally going to meet her. From the penthouse security feed, I watched the 4 of them cross the main lobby of Apex Biosolutions. The building was designed to communicate exactly what our work required: precision, capital, and control. 3 stories of glass rose above the reception floor and behind the central wall. A digital installation displayed active research programs, clinical partnerships, and international funding initiatives. Jamal had mocked my supposed clinic job for years, yet he now stood beneath my company's name, staring upward like a tourist. Ashley recovered first. She walked directly to the concierge desk and gave her name with the clipped confidence she used whenever she expected immediate recognition. She explained that she had a 10 o'clock appointment with the chief executive officer regarding an emergency medical grant. When the concierge asked for the patient reference number, Ashley glanced at Jamal as if the question were beneath her. Jamal supplied 402J. The system accepted it instantly. That small confirmation changed Ashley's posture. She smiled at Brenda as though she had personally unlocked the building. Brenda whispered that this was proof the Lord had opened the right door. Lexi looked around at the marble glass in restrained luxury with obvious calculation. I could almost see her trying to estimate how rich the person at the top of the building must be. Jamal was less interested in the architecture. He shifted his weight from one leg to the other and rubbed his hand across his wrist. The mist infusion was beginning to expose everything his expensive suit tried to hide. Still, when the concierge offered him a chair, he refused. He wanted to arrive upstairs looking like a powerful executive seeking a partnership, not a frightened patient asking for charity. Ashley asked whether the CEO had reviewed the documents she sent. The concierge replied that the executive office had the complete file. Ashley smiled again and told the others there was nothing to worry about. She said once the CEO heard how a lower-level administrative mistake had disrupted Jamal's treatment, Apex would restore the grant and probably apologize. I heard every word through the secure audio feed. At exactly 9:58, the private glass elevator opened. My assistant came down personally to escort them. That detail impressed Ashley more than anything else. She straightened her jacket, adjusted the folder under her arm, and told Brenda to let her speak first. She reminded Lexi not to record inside the executive suite. Then she placed a supportive hand near Jamal's elbow, as if she were leading a delegation she had assembled through sheer influence. The elevator rose along the interior atrium. As it climbed, the public floors gave way to restricted research levels and executive offices. The higher they went, the quieter the building became. Jamal watched the floor numbers change. Lexi pressed closer to the glass to look down at the shrinking lobby. Brenda stopped talking. Even Ashley's running commentary faded. By the time the elevator reached the penthouse, the scale of Apex had done what my arguments never could. It made them understand that whoever controlled this place was operating in a world far beyond Jamal's leased cars, social media posts, and country club name-dropping. The elevator chimed. Upstairs, I was already waiting. I sat at the head of the 20-foot custom glass conference table, waiting for the private executive elevator to finally reach the penthouse floor of the Apex Biosolutions headquarters. I had spent the entire morning preparing for this exact moment. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom were closed, but my security monitors showed me everything happening in the lobby below. I watched them arrive downstairs. I watched them stare up at the towering glass and steel architecture of the building I built from the ground up. Now they were ascending to the top floor, completely unaware of the reality waiting for them. I was wearing a bespoke dark charcoal Tom Ford suit tailored perfectly to my measurements. My hair was impeccably styled, and I wore a single pair of diamond stud earrings. I projected absolute power and unbothered wealth. This was not the wardrobe of a stagnant starter wife who pushed paperwork in a clinic basement. This was the armor of a chief executive officer about to decimate her enemies. I looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around the entire executive boardroom. The panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline was breathtaking under the bright morning sun. I could see the bustling city streets, the highways packed with cars, and the distant corporate towers belonging to my competitors. None of them mattered today. My entire focus was directed at the heavy oak doors at the end of the long room. I held a sleek digital tablet in my hands, slowly swiping through the clinical trial data of the very drug keeping my ex-husband alive. His numbers were already beginning to drop. Missing that single infusion session earlier in the week had triggered a cascade of inflammatory responses in his body. I knew his joints were aching. I knew his energy levels were plummeting. I knew the terrifying reality of his rare autoimmune condition was creeping back into his bones, reminding him that he was not the invincible alpha male he pretended to be. The soft chime of the private glass elevator echoed through the quiet reception area just outside the boardroom. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my eyes focused on my tablet, projecting an aura of complete professional detachment. Through the frosted glass panels of the hallway, I could see their blurry silhouettes stepping off the elevator. I could hear the sharp clicking of Ashley wearing designer heels marching across the polished marble floor. Ashley always walked like she owned every room she entered. She operated on a profound sense of unearned privilege, fully believing that her white corporate connections made her the most important person in any given situation. She was leading the pack, marching up to my executive concierge desk with her head held high. I listened as my executive assistant greeted them with a perfectly measured professional tone. My assistant welcomed them to the penthouse suite and confirmed they were the 10 o'clock emergency appointment. Ashley responded with a loud, condescending voice, making sure everyone in the reception area knew she was important. She told my assistant that they were there to see the chief executive officer regarding an urgent private grant for her brother-in-law. She name-dropped a few local politicians and a low-level hospital director she knew, trying to flex her network and intimidate my staff. My assistant simply smiled politely and asked them to follow her to the main boardroom. The heavy oak doors slowly swung open. My assistant walked into the expansive room first holding a leather folder. She stepped aside and gestured for the guest to enter. Ashley walked in first holding her designer handbag like a shield. Jamal followed closely behind her, leaning heavily on Lexi. My eyes flicked up from my tablet for just a fraction of a second to assess his physical condition. The arrogant, confident posture he had displayed in the mediation room was completely gone. His face was pale and drawn. He was moving stiffly, relying on Lexi for physical support to mask his failing balance. Lexi, however, was far too distracted by the sheer scale and luxury of the penthouse to properly assist him. She was looking up at the custom lighting fixtures and the expensive modern art on the walls, her mouth hanging slightly open. Brenda walked in last, clutching her purse to her chest and whispering a prayer of thanks to God for Ashley and her miraculous corporate connections. The four of them stepped onto the plush carpet of the boardroom, and the heavy oak doors closed behind them with a solid, resonant thud. They were officially locked inside my domain. The room fell into absolute silence. The sheer intimidating size of the 20-foot glass table and the breathtaking skyline view seemed to swallow them whole. They stood awkwardly near the entrance, waiting for the elusive chief executive officer to emerge from a back office and grant them salvation. I did not speak. I did not stand up. I simply sat at the head of the table, my face partially obscured by the soft glare of the window behind me. I continued to slowly swipe the screen of my tablet, letting the heavy silence stretch and amplify their anxiety. Ashley was the first person to truly look down the length of the long glass table. Her eyes scanned the ergonomic leather chairs before finally landing on me, sitting quietly at the head of the room. I watched her expression shift in real time. First, there was a flash of mild confusion as her brain tried to process a familiar face in an entirely unfamiliar environment. Then the confusion rapidly morphed into pure, unadulterated condescension. She let out a loud, dramatic scoff that echoed off the glass walls. She rolled her eyes and crossed her arms over her chest, completely disgusted by my presence. "Kendra," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "are you seriously the receptionist for the chief executive officer here?" Lexi snapped out of her materialistic trance and looked down the table. She saw me sitting there and immediately let out a high-pitched snicker. She nudged Jamal's arm and pointed at me, whispering that I must have gotten a new clinic job answering phones for rich people. Jamal squinted against the glare of the windows, finally focusing his vision on my face. The moment he recognized me, his pale complexion flushed with sudden defensive rage. He let go of Lexi's arm and stood up a little straighter, trying to push through the physical pain radiating through his joints. He was absolutely furious that I was sitting in the room witnessing his moment of weakness and desperation. "What are you doing here?" Jamal demanded, his voice rough and strained. "Are you stalking me now? Did you follow us here just to embarrass me in front of the executives? I told you I am a new man, Kendra. You need to let me go and stop obsessing over my life." Brenda stepped forward, shaking her head in profound disappointment. She looked at me like I was a cockroach that had crawled onto a pristine marble floor. She told Jamal not to let his blood pressure rise because of my pathetic behavior. Brenda announced to the empty room that my dark, heavy energy was a curse on their family. She said it made perfect sense that a woman with zero ambition would end up fetching coffee and answering phones for a massive corporate entity while her son was upstairs securing million-dollar medical grants. She told me I should be ashamed of myself for following them to a private medical meeting just to beg for his attention. Ashley took a step closer to the table, acting like she had the authority to dictate my movements. She slammed her hand down on the glass surface, demanding my immediate compliance. She told me to get out of the boardroom right this second. She said they had a highly confidential medical meeting scheduled with the chief executive officer, and they did not have time to deal with a bitter ex-wife playing receptionist. She threatened to call building security and have me thrown out onto the street if I did not pack up my little tablet and leave the room before the real bosses arrived. Ashley stood there radiating white corporate privilege, truly believing she held all the power in the room because she knew how to send an email to a general inbox. I remained perfectly still. I did not react to Jamal's accusations of stalking. I did not respond to Brenda's toxic insults about my energy. I did not flinch when Ashley slammed her hand against my custom glass table. I just sat there in my bespoke Tom Ford suit looking at four people who had absolutely no idea they were standing at the bottom of a very deep grave. They thought they had bypassed the system. They thought Ashley had saved the day with her networking skills. They thought Jamal was about to receive a magical influx of cash from a generous billionaire who wanted to invest in his superior alpha male potential. They thought I was a pathetic, heartbroken woman clinging to a low-level administrative job just to catch a glimpse of the man who discarded me. I set my tablet down on the glass table. The soft click of the device hitting the surface was the only sound in the room. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and looked directly into Ashley's arrogant, demanding eyes. I let the corner of my mouth turn up into a small, razor-sharp smile. The trap was perfectly set. The audience was assembled. The doors were closed. It was finally time to show them exactly who they were dealing with. I did not blink. I looked right into Ashley, arrogant, demanding eyes, and let the silence stretch for one more agonizing second. I reached out and pressed a small silver button hidden underneath the edge of my quartz desk. Instantly, the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the boardroom turned completely opaque. A soft mechanical hum filled the room as the electronic locks on the heavy oak doors engaged. We were completely sealed in. Ashley took a step back, her confident posture finally cracking just a fraction. I spoke in a voice that was perfectly calm and impossibly cold. I told Ashley I was not the receptionist. I watched her pale face contort in confusion. I pronounced every single word with absolute clarity. I told her I was the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Biosolutions. I told her this was my building, my boardroom, and my medical network. The color completely drained from Ashley's face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked around the massive room, suddenly realizing that the luxury and power she had been admiring belonged entirely to the black woman she had spent years treating like dirt. Jamal let out a strange, choking sound. His legs literally gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily into one of the ergonomic leather chairs, gripping the armrests with trembling hands. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. He shook his head slowly, muttering that it was impossible. He said I just worked a boring admin job at a local clinic. He tried to tell his mother and Lexi that this was some kind of elaborate prank. I did not raise my voice to argue with his denial. I simply reached into the drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick stack of printed financial documents. I stood up and tossed the heavy stack of papers right onto the center of the 20-foot glass table. The documents landed with a loud slap that made everyone in the room flinch. I looked down at Jamal and told him it was time to review his actual financial energy. I told him to look at the top page of the stack. It was a detailed corporate ledger showing every single anonymous grant and medical payment my company had funneled to his private clinic over the last 3 years. I told him the exact total. I told him I had quietly paid over $5 million to keep his organs functioning and keep him out of a wheelchair. I watched his eyes scan the highlighted numbers on the page. I watched the arrogant self-made corporate consultant realize that his entire life was a charity project funded by the woman he had discarded. I did not stop there. I pointed to the second page in the stack. I told him that document contained the patent registration for the highly experimental immunotherapy drug that was currently keeping him alive. I told him I owned those patents. I told him he did not cure himself with a superior alpha male mindset or positive thinking. I told him he was alive right now simply because I allowed him to have access to my proprietary medical technology. I reminded him of the horrible things he said to me in the mediation room just a few days ago. I reminded him how he said I was dead weight holding him back from his true potential. I told him that as of last week, I was no longer legally or financially responsible for the man who cheated on me. I told him I had officially cut his funding. Lexi slowly walked toward the glass table. Her designer heels clicked softly against the carpet. She was not highly educated, but she knew how to read a balance sheet. She looked down at the financial ledgers and the medical billing statements. She saw the massive debts attached to Jamal's name. She saw the outstanding balance of $150,000 from his missed clinic appointment. She saw the repossession notices for the luxury cars and the liquidation notice for the downtown condo that my legal team had just initiated. She looked up from the papers and stared at Jamal. The manufactured adoration in her eyes was completely gone. It was replaced by pure, unadulterated disgust. Lexi realized in that exact moment that she had not stolen a wealthy, high-value provider. She realized she had ruined her own reputation for a man who was drowning in insurmountable debt and struggling with a serious chronic illness. She realized Jamal had absolutely nothing left to offer her. There would be no shopping trips in Paris. There would be no million-dollar houses. There would only be collection agencies and hospital visits. She looked at Jamal shivering in the leather chair and she made her decision instantly. Lexi reached over with her acrylic nails and unclasped the massive diamond tennis bracelet from her wrist. The heavy piece of jewelry slid off her skin and she threw it directly onto the glass table. The diamonds clattered against the surface, sliding over the financial documents. Lexi glared at Jamal and told him he was a pathetic broke fraud. She yelled that she did not spend hours getting ready every morning just to be a hospice nurse for a man who could not even afford his own medical bills. She told him he lied to her about his wealth and his lifestyle. She said she was young and beautiful and she was not going to waste her best years taking care of a sick man who lived on an allowance from his ex-wife. Lexi turned around and marched toward the heavy oak doors. She demanded that my assistant unlock the doors immediately so she could get away from these miserable people. I nodded to my assistant, who pressed the security release. The doors swung open. Lexi walked out without looking back, leaving Jamal completely shattered and utterly alone in his misery. The sound of her heels faded down the hallway, marking the abrupt end of his grand romantic fantasy. Jamal sat in the chair, looking like a hollow shell of a human being. The reality of his physical condition was catching up to him rapidly. Without the medication, his joints were swelling and his breathing was becoming shallow. He looked at the diamond bracelet sitting on top of his debt notices. He looked at me with tears streaming down his face. He finally understood the magnitude of what he had thrown away. He had traded a loyal wife who quietly saved his life for a superficial girl who abandoned him the second the money ran out. Brenda was hyperventilating. The toxic, proud woman who had spent years telling me I was not good enough for her son was now faced with the undeniable truth. Her golden boy was a total failure without my protection. She realized that the luxury lifestyle she had been bragging about to her church friends was entirely funded by my hard work. She realized Jamal was going to be forced to move back into her cramped basement, and she would have to watch him struggle through standard care because they could not afford the experimental treatment he had taken for granted. Brenda let out a loud, sobbing wail. She physically collapsed onto the plush carpet of the boardroom. She fell to her knees right in front of the glass table. She clasped her hands together and began begging me. The woman who had called me a dark cloud just days ago was now weeping and pleading for my mercy. She begged me to turn the funding back on. She begged me to save her son. She promised me that Jamal would change. She said he made a terrible mistake, but he still loved me deep down. She cried that I could not just let him die because we were supposed to be family. I looked down at Brenda kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely no pity for her. I told her very calmly that family does not pop champagne in a mediation lobby to celebrate another woman's pain. I told her she wanted Lexi to be her new daughter-in-law, and now she had to deal with the consequences of that choice. I told Brenda to use her own financial energy to save her son because my charity had officially run dry. Ashley was standing frozen near the wall, completely silent. Her corporate privilege could not save her here. She had no network powerful enough to override my authority in my own building. She had led her family right into a slaughterhouse because she wanted to play the hero and show off her connections. She realized she had just humiliated herself in front of one of the most powerful executives in the city. She knew her career and her social standing were in severe jeopardy. Jamal slowly pushed himself up from the chair. His body was trembling. He reached his hand across the wide glass table, reaching out toward me. He was crying openly now, tears falling onto his expensive, ruined suit. He called my name, his voice weak and pathetic. He pleaded with me, telling me he was sorry. He said he was blind and arrogant. He begged me to forgive him and told me we could fix this. He said he needed me. I looked at his outstretched hand. I did not feel an ounce of the love I used to carry for him. I simply felt repulsed. I pulled my hand back and took a step away from the table. I looked at the three of them, broken, crying, and completely defeated. They had tried to bury me, but they did not realize I was the one who owned the land. I reached out and pressed the silver intercom button on my desk. I spoke clearly into the microphone. I said, "Security, please escort my ex-husband and his guests off my property. They are trespassing, and they are no longer welcome in this building." I released the button and turned my back on them, looking out at the beautiful city I had conquered. Security arrived less than a minute later. I did not turn around while the doors opened behind me. I heard Brenda protest that Jamal was sick. I heard Ashley insist that there had been a misunderstanding. Jamal said my name once more, softer this time, but I kept my eyes on the Atlanta skyline. My staff escorted them out without shouting, without spectacle, and without giving them one more opportunity to turn my boardroom into a family argument. When the doors finally closed, the room became quiet again. I looked at the diamond bracelet Lexi had abandoned on top of the financial records. I asked my assistant to have legal document the item and return it through the proper channel because it had been purchased from a joint account before the freeze. Then I gathered the patient ledgers and placed them back into the folder. The meeting was over. Jamal's treatment decisions would now move through the same clinical and financial systems available to any other self-pay patient. I was not his wife, his nurse, his private banker, or his invisible sponsor anymore. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They arrived like bills finally reaching the correct address. The first was the condo. The 30-day notice from the Apex-controlled holding company had already been delivered, but Jamal had ignored it while he believed Ashley could restore his grant. Once the boardroom meeting exposed the ownership records, there was nothing left to debate. His attorney reviewed the documents and confirmed what the mediation language had always said: Jamal had retained occupancy, not ownership. The property belonged to the corporate entity that owned it before the divorce, and that entity was liquidating the asset. Lexi did not wait 30 days. She removed her clothes within 48 hours. The glossy social media videos disappeared one by one. The house tour clips vanished. The posts mocking my wardrobe were deleted. Her followers noticed, of course, but she never published the dramatic explanation they wanted. She simply stopped presenting Jamal as her high-value man and rebuilt her feed around herself. Jamal stayed until the final week because leaving felt like admitting the truth. By then, the luxury image had become impossible to maintain. The vehicle leases he had bragged about required payments he could no longer make. One car disappeared from the condo garage first. The second followed days later. He told people the vehicles were being traded for newer models, but there were no newer models. The leasing companies had repossessed them. His consulting work also began to suffer. The problem was not that I interfered with his career. I did not call his employer clients or colleagues. I did not need to. Jamal had built his professional identity around energy, confidence, travel, and constant availability. Without the experimental treatment, his symptoms returned in ways he could not hide. Meetings were postponed. Trips were canceled. He began missing deadlines because some mornings his joints were too inflamed for him to move easily. The same man who had mocked weakness now had to ask for accommodations he once treated as evidence that other people lacked discipline. I explored every medical option available to him. The elite clinic gave him complete records and explained the self-pay requirements again. His standard insurer maintained the denial of the experimental treatment. He appealed. The appeal moved slowly. He sought conventional alternatives through the broader healthcare system, where specialists had waiting lists, prior authorization requirements, and treatment protocols that did not bend because he once wore an expensive suit into a private lobby. Eventually, the condo closed for sale. Jamal moved into Brenda's basement. The irony spread through the family faster than any social media video Lexi had posted. Brenda had spent years telling people her son was destined for luxury. Now his suits hung from a portable rack beside storage boxes, and his medication schedule was taped to a refrigerator downstairs. She discovered how expensive pride became when the person who had quietly paid the invoices stopped answering them. I did not visit. I did not call to check whether the basement was comfortable. I received necessary legal updates through my team and nothing more. Ashley, however, could not tolerate the humiliation quietly. About 3 weeks after the Apex meeting, she published a long LinkedIn article about what she called unethical power in private biomedical funding. She never admitted that she had walked into my office demanding a discretionary grant for a relative. Instead, she implied that Apex had endangered a patient because of a personal dispute involving its CEO. She described an unnamed executive who weaponized access to experimental medicine and suggested that powerful founders should not be allowed to decide who lives or dies. The post spread through her professional network. For a few hours, Ashley received exactly the validation she wanted. People who did not know the facts praised her for speaking about healthcare accountability. She liked every supportive comment and added vague replies about standing up to powerful people. Then my legal team responded. We did not argue with her on LinkedIn. We sent a formal cease and desist supported by the documents she had ignored. The letter explained that Jamal had not been denied medical records, emergency care, or access to treatment because of his relationship with me. A discretionary corporate subsidy had ended after the qualifying executive authorization was withdrawn. The clinic had offered treatment on a self-pay basis. The insurer's denial predated the divorce by years. Every statement was backed by dated records. Ashley was given an opportunity to correct her claims. Instead, she doubled down. She told people the letter was intimidation. That decision turned an embarrassing post into a legal problem. Apex filed a defamation action focused narrowly on statements that falsely accused the company of conduct contradicted by the records. Once the documents entered the dispute, Ashley's employers could no longer treat her social media campaign as harmless personal commentary. Her firm had strict rules about public allegations involving clients' healthcare entities and confidential family matters. She had used her professional title to give credibility to claims she had not verified. She was placed on leave and later terminated. I did not celebrate that either. Ashley had been warned. She chose escalation because she believed confidence could replace evidence, the same mistake Jamal made at the cookout, the clinic, and my boardroom. By the third month, the noise around my divorce had faded. Apex kept growing. We expanded research partnerships, added funding to the autoimmune platform, and prepared new data for regulatory review. I stopped checking whether anyone in Jamal's family was talking about me, because their opinions no longer influenced a single decision in my life. 6 months after the mediation, my assistant walked into my office carrying an advance copy of Black Enterprise. My photograph was on the cover. The feature focused on Apex Biosolutions, our funding model, and the way our patent portfolio was accelerating access to difficult biomedical research. The headline described me as one of the innovators reshaping medical technology investment. The article did not mention Jamal. It did not mention Lexi, Brenda, or Ashley. That mattered more to me than any revenge headline ever could. My life was finally being described by what I built instead of what I survived. I placed the magazine on a shelf in my office and went back to work. That evening, a small circle of friends took me to dinner at an exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant downtown. There were no speeches about my divorce. Nobody asked me to retell the boardroom scene. We talked about travel, business, ridiculous childhood memories, and plans for the coming year. I realized halfway through the meal that I had gone nearly an hour without thinking about Jamal. Then I looked toward the floor-to-ceiling window. Rain had started outside, turning the sidewalk into a sheet of reflected city lights. People hurried past beneath umbrellas. Near the edge of the glass stood a man waiting for the pedestrian signal. It was Jamal. For a second, I barely recognized him. He had lost weight. His shoulders were rounded beneath a dark jacket that looked too large for him. One hand held a small plastic pharmacy bag. The other rested against the wall for balance. There was no luxury car waiting at the curb, no Lexi filming, no Brenda praising her golden boy, no audience at all. He lifted his head. Our eyes met through the glass. I saw recognition move across his face, followed by something I could not fully name. Regret, perhaps. Shame. Maybe anger at a world that no longer arranged itself around his ego. Months earlier, I would have tried to interpret every expression because I believed his feelings were my responsibility. Now I simply saw a man I used to know. I did not smile at his condition. I did not point him out to my friends. I did not raise my phone or take a photograph. His illness was not entertainment, and his downfall did not need my applause. I lifted my wine glass slightly. Not a toast to his suffering. A quiet acknowledgement that we had seen each other and that there was nothing left to say. Jamal remained on the sidewalk for another moment. Then the pedestrian light changed. He turned and disappeared into the rain with the pharmacy bag swinging at his side. I turned back to the table. One of my friends was in the middle of a story that had everyone laughing. I caught the last few words and laughed with them. The wine was excellent. The room was warm. My company was thriving. My home was peaceful. Nobody at the table needed me to shrink so they could feel important. For years, I had mistaken sacrifice for love and silence for loyalty. I believed protecting Jamal from the truth would protect our marriage. All it did was allow him to build an identity on support he refused to acknowledge. The divorce did not destroy his life. It simply removed me from the job of preventing every consequence. I took another sip of wine and faced the people who had come to celebrate my future. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, I never looked back. True empowerment comes when you stop shrinking yourself to protect the fragile egos of those who do not value you. Kendra shows us that loyalty should never cost you your dignity or peace of mind. When we silently fund the lives of toxic people, we only enable our own disrespect. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love is simply walking away and allowing natural consequences to take their course. Your worth is not defined by how much you can sacrifice for an ungrateful partner, but by how fiercely you protect your own peace and hard-earned empire. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic relationship to protect your peace, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering content.